It's great to be here, and thanks for having me. I've got a few remarks. Hopefully they won't be too long. I really want to get into some conversation with all of you about some of these really, really important issues that we're dealing with and that all of us have to deal with going forward. So I should start by saying that Google is basically a company that's been founded on the belief that information is a social good. More information in more hands means more education, economic opportunity, accountability, and so on. Access, in a word, is good. It's why the internet's so incredibly freeing, and it's also this idea of the simple fact of getting online is, in many ways, has power that's been unmatched in human history. So just take a minute to think about how much more freedom we have today to innovate, create, to communicate, collaborate with each other. The scale of creation on YouTube is staggering, and it really illustrates the point. Each minute, 100 hours of video are uploaded onto YouTube, and you may not believe this, but it's not all cat videos. But think about the collaboration that's happened, like with Wikipedia, right? You've got 3,000 users contributing like more than 100 articles, and edits every month. And they're building an encyclopedia that's comprehensive and current and available to anyone. So millions of people also use all the other social media services. I'm sure many of you use things like Twitter as your main news source, maybe your only news source, and you get the picture. Internet's also given us insight into what's happening around the world, insight that helps us to preserve individual freedom, improve lives, and protect our world for the future. Now, recently, we were all pretty horrified to learn about the atrocities committed against civilians in Syria. And it's worth reflecting on how that event unfolded for a moment, because had it happened 25 years ago, I don't think the global community would ever have known what was going on. But today, Syrian activists can use YouTube to communicate what's happening inside the country to millions of people who follow things like Syria Pioneer, which is a channel on YouTube to get daily updates. Knowledge is power, and the knowledge that individuals are suffering empowers the global community to do something about it. Now, it's astonishing how effective the internet is at surfacing information about the world, even when there are governments and others trying to suppress it. North Korea, a country with few connections to the rest of the world, in North Korea, a community of cartographers or citizens who sort of were amateur map makers came together to use Google Mapmaker to add more detail to the maps in North Korea, and this was done in 2013. The maps show actually the location of the gulags and sort of work camps where the North Korean government is believed to hold citizens for all sorts of crimes, most likely political dissent. And so it's just one way that individuals are empowered by the internet to share what's happening around them. Internet can, in very basic ways, improve the lives of people around the world in more mundane ways. Take a farmer, not the typical person we think that benefits from the internet. But when a disease ravaged Kenya's potato crops, there's a farmer named Zach Matere who turned to the internet to search for potato disease. He found a website that told him that ants were eating his potato stems and that a simple cure was just to sprinkle some wood ash on the crop. 2 months later, his potatoes recovered, they were back in shape, and he was pretty happy. He also found local buyers for his crop, and he continues to use the web to get real-time potato prices, something he couldn't do before. So the internet's been foundational in sparking all of these improvements to our lives. But instead of seeking ways to help the web flourish, many governments are actually getting in its way. Indeed, in what may be the sharpest government learning curve in the history, they think that they can control and shape this new global phenomenon by regulating the flow of information online. And sadly, they're doing it at an alarming pace. The number of governments that are filtering or controlling the internet is growing at breakneck speed, probably 10 times over the last 10 years, according to research by the OpenNet Institute. It's probably going to continue to do so. We're 15 years old at Google, and our services have been blocked at some point in at least 32 countries. Since 2007, YouTube's been blocked by governments in at least 19 countries. Now, you might think that governments outright blocking Google services is not really a problem, In the Western world, it's all these, these far-flung autocratic governments that are doing this. And to some extent, you're right. But Europe and the U.S. are actually, in some ways, at the forefront of the innovative kinds of efforts by governments to restrict access to information. In Europe, we're in the midst of 2 legal proceedings that actually risk establishing censorship regimes. I can't say a lot about the details because they're ongoing court cases, but let me give you some background on one of them to illustrate the challenge. You may have heard of a guy named Max Mosley. He had something to do with like Formula One and racing cars or something. But he was videotaped engaging in sexual behavior with 5 women who were paid to participate. He acknowledged the pictures were, they were true and they were factual. But, he didn't like them very much, and he wasn't pleased when a newspaper published the photos and put them online for everybody, including search engines, to find and look at. Now, Europe's existing laws promote a notice and takedown regime for situations like this. So once you get, to the extent it's illegal and so forth, and I guess he was claiming this defamed him. Now, once you get the notice about the offending link or image, then folks like us have to remove it. And we've done this for Mr. Mosley, removing hundreds of pages from our search results. But Mr. Mosley asked for more, something more radical. He wants Google to build automated filters to find and then suppress these images so no one ever sees them, even if they appear in the context of news reporting, for instance. And earlier this fall, a French court ruled that Google must do exactly that. We have to build a memory hole into the infrastructure of the internet. It was a troubling ruling with really serious consequences for free expression. Obviously, we're going to appeal it. Now, in just the first 6 months of 2013, we received more than 3,500 requests from governments around the world asking that we remove, in total, about 25,000 independent pieces of content from our services. That was the highest number of requests that we've seen to date, and pretty worrisome because of the growing numbers of requests to take down actual political speech. And now you've probably seen in the news new laws in Russia that just came into effect, new law being proposed and coming into effect in Turkey, which don't even make any excuses about going after other kinds of speech, but are actually directed specifically at political dissent and speech. So, but some examples on some more mundane situations. We received a request from an Italian city government to remove a YouTube video that violates this is sort of a city council person. This YouTube video allegedly violates his privacy because it includes an image of his face on a campaign poster. Now, we got 2 requests from Mexican government officials that we remove a blog and a YouTube video that defamed them by accusing them of corruption. Final example, a member of parliament in the UK asked us to remove a blog post just for suggesting that he advised businesses while he was serving in government. Doesn't seem like, this doesn't seem like horrible, life-threatening content, but people are asking us to take it down all the time. So don't just take my word for it. Others have noted this as well. Freedom House produces an annual Freedom of the Net report. In 2013, they found that internet freedom has declined in 34 over the previous year in 34 of 60 countries that they surveyed. Twitter has a transparency report. They report that government requests for user information increased by 73% between 2012 and 2013. Now, adding to the complexity of all of this is that multiple levels of government are getting into the game. We've got laws targeting the internet in individual U.S. states. They're really skyrocketing. We've got over 500 such bills that were under review in state legislatures this year. Child protection. They have all kinds of rationales, but most of them go at provide for some sort of censorship. Nation states around the world are proposing laws to regulate the use of the internet. I've mentioned some of those. And on top of that, international bodies such as the ITU have been making efforts to establish rules for internet use that would probably supersede all of these national efforts. So I haven't talked yet about the role of the U.S. government in all of this and how the U.S. government facilitates attempts to clamp down on web freedom. Because of our country's long history of free expression, The U.S., to be sure, has been sort of less active in outright attempts to limit speech. But as we saw earlier this year and last year, the NSA has been engaged in some pretty chilling surveillance of previously unknown scale and scope. And it's hard to measure the chilling effect that these revelations are going to have on individual expression around the world, but they're significant. This was, the NSA programs were a shot directly at the heart of trust in the web, trust in the companies that offer services on the internet, and it remains, we don't know yet how bad it's going to be. The US government's sort of approach to this when the revelations came out was also singularly unhelpful. Things like, don't worry, it's just foreigners, and so forth, didn't help. So what's gone on here is the reaction to that. So we've all seen what has been the reaction to that in the rest of the world. Well, it's not been good. We've got Brazil looking at a law to restrict access to internet services based on where physical servers are that operate the servers, the services. We've got Indonesia, we've got France, and now we have Germany. The Chancellor of Germany just came out in favor of this the other day. This notion of data localization. Imagine how diminished our internet experience would be if we could only use services that could afford to set up shop in our country. I doubt you'd have, WhatsApp. Still scratching my head at that one. Twitter, Google, et cetera. It would be very hard, right? In the next, Google, very hard for that to get going if no one from outside the country where it was founded could access it. Now, the ultimate consequence of all this jockeying by local, national, institutional bodies is really this future of splinter nets, an end to the global internet as we've come to know it. It's a future where creativity and economic activity and speech become more geographically bordered again. Now, if we let this network for global communication and information slip from our hands and devolve into the same national networks that came before it, I think we'll be making a pretty big mistake. We really want the web to be conducive to communities, to be a social layer in our society that's integrated into our daily lives. And it's going to require trust that's grown not just from top-down regulation and governments doing stuff, but from the considered codification of norms that are going to evolve over time. So I want to highlight a few challenges that we've got to address here in what is kind of a critical time. First of all, we've got to find better ways to make governments accountable. Now, one way to do this is through transparency. You can't hold your government accountable when you don't know what they're up to. Now, we've led the charge of that on this issue at Google for a number of years. We were the first company to come up with this, to disclose government demands for user data and government demands to take down content in something that we call the Transparency Report. And since then, other companies have jumped on the bandwagon, mostly tech companies, but increasingly we even have the telcos. Verizon, AT&T are starting to be much more transparent about what they're up to. Hopefully we can get more governments to do this. Hong Kong actually decided to do this and released for the first time last year the number of requests that the Hong Kong government actually makes to ISPs to get user data. So we think sunlight is critical, and we're eager to see more companies and governments join us in this effort over the coming months and years. Now, a second way to deal with accountability is through having really good rules of law, right? Governments and access user data, we need to make sure they do so in the context of legitimate law enforcement investigations, that they're following the same sort of rule of law requirements that we demand in the offline world. You want information about somebody, you should get a warrant. It shouldn't turn on whether it's a letter or it's an email or it's an email that's 30 days old or an email that's 180 days old or an email that's been read or not read. We should have rules that we all sort of understand. Obviously, as we've seen from the NSA revelations, this hasn't been the case, and we've got to reform that. Now, the second challenge here is that governments going to need to appreciate that the internet's a global resource. Its architecture can't be sort of dictated by national governments. We've got a lot of governments talking about digital sovereignty now. And this is a discourse that ultimately ends in every country sort of claiming that their national laws ought to apply to the rest of the world. And we've seen at Google the consequences of this kind of extraterritorial application of laws to the web, and we've seen this firsthand. In 2007, we had learned that the Turkish government had blocked access to YouTube for all Turkish internet users in response to some videos that the government believed insulted Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. Now, that's a crime under Turkish law, so the judge ordered the Turkish ISPs to block access to YouTube entirely. Now, we thought we'd resolve the situation by removing Turkish access to the videos, so that if you're in Turkey, you couldn't see them. But the judge in Turkey declared that the videos have to come down for everyone, for all users, everywhere around the world. Right, imagine that. So, you imagine lowest common denominator, everything around the world. We resisted that, and we were actually blocked in Turkey for years, until maybe just about 18 months ago or so. We finally got blocked in a very interesting way, was lifted. So the internet would lose a lot of its value, right, if it was devolved into a series of these national internets, or if one government could actually dictate what goes on for everybody. We obviously don't want that to happen. Now, there are ways to square the legitimate desires of governments to enforce laws within their countries with a global internet. We've been doing this since the beginning of Google. We've figured out a way to comply with some local laws that we're willing to comply with. For instance, in France and Germany, Nazi information is illegal, right? So, if you're in Germany and you call up Google, you go to the Google German site. It's a domain in Germany, and on that site, when we get a takedown notice for Nazi or something that's illegal in Germany but not, say, illegal in the United States, we enforce that on that site, but not globally, not for the rest of the world. And that's critically important because we want to make sure that German government doesn't censor the web for everyone else. Now, it's almost trivially easy for a German internet user to click on a link that says google.com and go to the global site where they can find that information, right? But that's a good thing. It turns out that most people, if the default is set to the local experience, they usually use the local experience. So it's a good way to sort of balance the two things, right? A government saying, well, we want some enforcement of what our citizens have elected us to enforce, with freedom and the ability for other people around the world to see the content. Now, obviously, there's some governments that aren't elected. There's some governments and there's some places where we don't want to do that. China, for example, right? We don't want to be in China behind the firewall and complying with their law, even if we're only complying for Chinese citizens. So the third thing I wanted to talk about was a way to find ways for governments to contribute to internet governance without sort of building some kind of top-down institutional regulatory regime. Now, the internet currently is governed by a multi-stakeholder system, and the ways of engagement for governments are different in the internet than in, say, telecommunications. About 10 years ago at the World Summit on Information Society, the world's heads of state recognized this idea where they said that the internet should be formed by, internet policy should be formed by shared principles, rules, and decision-making procedures in a way that includes government, includes the private sector, and civil society all on sort of an equal footing. And governments don't like this, but that's the way the internet's been governed. And I think we need to find ways for governments to get involved, but what we don't want them to do is to take the whole thing over and run it in some kind of majority rule, United Nations kinds of things, where again we risk going to the lowest common denominator. It's always interesting to remember the words of Professor David Clark, who was in the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is one of the key stakeholders here, when he said that we reject kings, presidents, and voting, and we believe in rough consensus and in running code. So we've sort of had this governance that has been from the bottom up with lots of different voices. We need that to continue. Fourth thing I would point out is that we need to continue to build open information flows into the trading system. If you think about, well, wait a minute, we have all these countries that want to censor the web, that want to restrict free flow of information. How do we deal with this? Now, one way would be to say, well, this is a human rights issue, right? So we should, most of these countries that are doing this have signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19 of which preserves the right of free expression. You might say, well, why don't we hold these countries to account? Well, we all know how hard that is, right? And any kind of, whenever you get into human rights, you get into politics and sovereignty and so forth. And so that might be a very difficult thing to do. One thing that perhaps is not as difficult is to build these concepts into trade agreements, right? All these countries want to participate in global trade. They want to participate in the internet boom, all the economic opportunity that the internet's providing. Well, if we had rules around what you could and couldn't do, what's protectionism versus legitimate regulation in the sort of world of goods and manufactured goods and commodities, why not have that with information when information is the critical sort of resource out there? And so we've been working very hard to get these concepts into trade agreements. We've had some success in that. Recently, the U.S. Trade Representative, Michael Froman, did a speech where he talked about incorporating that kind of language and those kinds of principles into the Trans-Pacific Agreement that they're negotiating, and also the one with the Europeans. So slow progress, but if you think about what's the actionable way to get free expression, internet freedom in there, and get some rules that governments have to abide by, we think that that's a pretty good way to go. Finally, I'd just say that internet users are going to have to be involved in this too. We're going to have to stay educated. We're going to have to take action when we need to. We all have to fight for the kind of internet that we believe in, that we want to see. We in Silicon Valley, we had a good moment a couple years ago when we fought against a really bad copyright law in the United States. We've had similar things in Europe where there's some bad copyright laws, some bad censorship laws. You saw people in the streets in Turkey over the past couple weeks because of this internet law. So it's going to take a lot of activism online in the streets and so forth to make sure that our voices are heard and that we can continue to have an internet that's free and open. So anyway, that's the end of my comments. I think Jennifer is going to say a few things, and then hopefully we can have a discussion. Thank you.
I'm Jennifer Granick. I'm the Director of Civil Liberties, and I have the pleasure of commenting on David Drummond's remarks today. And then after I'm done, we'll open it up to questions. But first, I just want to take a moment to thank some of the people who helped make this event possible today. I want to thank Simone Davis, who's David's personal assistant, for helping make this happen. And I also want to thank Elaine Adolfo, Allison Neumeister, and Kathleen Barkos for their logistical assistance in making this happen. So thank you guys for doing this. Computer security expert Dan Geer once said that the internet was built by academics, researchers, and hackers. And as a result of this origin, it embodies a particular cultural interpretation of American values. The internet was designed to be open, non-hierarchical, self-organizing, and essentially ungovernable, beyond a few basic protocols which were required in order to help multiple parties communicate over distributed fiber optic cables. Depending on who you are, this either warms your heart or scares the bejesus out of you. And David and I are both on the heart-warmed side. As David argued tonight, the internet has been an unimaginable public good. And as a result, we have seen more prosperity, better education, wonderful advances in political activism and personal creativity. In short, a flourishing of freedom. It is no surprise that the internet was born in a nation with a First and a Fourth Amendment, and it is no surprise that it has flourished in a land that has CDA 230, a law which exempts intermediaries from liability for the speech of their users. In my opinion, the internet is perhaps the greatest liberation technology that we have seen to date. On the other hand, the governments around the world are terrified by the internet for the usual reasons. there are real problems on the network. Child pornography, censorship, surveillance, copyright infringement, hate speech, and governments increasingly tend to talk about the internet as if its most salient characteristics are its most dangerous ones. That critical infrastructure is under attack, that criminals and thieves are running amok, stealing our valuable data, that state secrets will be revealed to the detriment of public safety, and that radicals will organize on the internet below the radar in order to attack civilians through terrorism and to overthrow governments. Whether, how, and who should address these problems and how serious they really are is changing the public approach to the internet. This is the battle that we're fighting now. And what we're seeing is that the benefits of the internet are under threat because of efforts to address these problems, which are serious to varying degrees. For governments, they like to use law. When we talk about the tools that you have in order to affect change, there's technology, law, norms, and policy, and governments like law because when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And to some governments, they need the law because the inherent American nature of the internet is in itself distasteful. Depending on what government, it either wants the internet to be a more civilized place or a more subservient one. So governments come to companies which are increasingly the place that pressure can be put. As we have consolidation of services and many, many people using single big services, whether it be a search engine or a social network, governments come and they put pressure there. They ask for goodwill assistance with surveillance. They ask for companies to put backdoors in their products to enable wiretapping. And they demand encryption keys so that they can conduct surveillance against people. Increasingly, companies are facing a very difficult choice, a very difficult position of protecting their users and complying with government requests, even sometimes government requests that are lawful. Companies sometimes face a choice, comply or shut down. And this is what secure email service provider LavaBit had to do earlier this year when the US government came to it and demanded its encryption keys, disclosure of which would have endangered the privacy of all of its users' communications. Google's not going to shut down if a secret order demands its encryption key in the United States. It just can't. So the nature of the internet is changing. What can companies do for us about secret orders to warrantly wiretap their customers en masse? We've learned recently that the NSA is conducting warrantless surveillance directed at targeting non-US persons reasonably believed to be overseas, not for wrongdoing, but just for foreign intelligence purposes, which is an extremely broad category, which includes anything related to the conduct of the United States foreign affairs. Very, very broad category. What can companies do about this? These people are their customers. Will companies like Google and Facebook and Yahoo and Twitter put their money and their political clout on the line in order to protect these users? Now, these companies have sued for transparency, and Google has been a leader in transparency. But transparency is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And in our current political climate here in the United States, the truth of the matter is, no matter how much we take to the streets, no matter how organized we are, mass surveillance of people overseas, never mind us here in the United States, will not end unless commercial interests go to Congress and tell them this affects our bottom line and this is hurting people's privacy and we need it to stop. If Congress doesn't do anything about it, then other nations are going to try, and they're going to continue to proliferate these laws that will say, you have to store your data here. Now, that's a dumb idea, because when you store, if a company, like let's say Google stores its Brazilian customers' data in Brazil, that's not going to stop the NSA from getting that information. They can still walk through the front door and ask Google to turn it over. They could also pick it up overseas with way fewer restrictions than they currently have for conducting surveillance inside the United States, and you've enabled another surveillance party, the Brazilian government. Now they have authority to demand that information too. To my mind, local data storage is not just a threat to innovation, but it is a threat to the privacy of internet users worldwide, and would be a dangerous and a real detriment. On the other hand, there are great steps forward that companies can take, and that, for example, Google and Yahoo have taken. When we learned that the NSA was surveilling unencrypted data center to data center transfers overseas, Google was able to put a stop to that simply by encrypting those communications with SSL. So in many ways, our civil liberties rely on what governments do, but our civil liberties are also very dependent upon the platforms that we use. And those platforms are subject to commercial pressures as well as to government pressures. Google was great about encrypting data center links when it found out that GCHQ was the UK intelligence agency was hacking into those links. But Gmail will always reside unencrypted on servers, because that's the way you provide an ad-based service. And if your email is unencrypted on the servers, then it's there for governments to come and to request it. Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who is the founder of the World Wide Web, has said recently that what we need to do is we need to re-decentralize the web so that there are fewer choke points. He has said that it's worrisome that so much of our online activities are reliant on a few big companies with a few big servers. And I believe that's true. We must be vigilant about the commercial pressures that companies are under in handling user rights and user content just as much. We must be vigilant, but not just as much as we must be vigilant about government, because government is the threat. They are the pressure point, and it's governments who view the internet as dangerous lawlessness and not as public freedom that are the ones that are pressuring to change the network's character. Dan Geer said that because of these pressures from government, that the internet will never again be as free as it is this very second. But I'm an optimistic person, so I do not believe that that's true. But I agree with David that in order for us to keep the internet free and to reverse the tide that we've seen with censorship and surveillance, that we have a lot of work to do, and that work weighs very heavily on the shoulders of the companies that we rely on to carry our communications, and very, very heavily on ours as well. So I hope that people who care about this topic will also put their economic and their political assets on the line and work hard on these internet freedom issues in the future. So we are going to take questions. If you want to ask questions, you need to line up.
While people are queuing up for questions, sure, I respond. I can't say there was anything I disagreed with Jennifer on. I think that we clearly, the companies clearly have to be in the leadership here in fighting for surveillance reform and internet freedom. We are doing that. You know, we finally have a united voice amongst the technology companies, and we're going to Washington. We are lobbying aggressively. We had full page ads, basically telling Congress we've come to town and we're not going to stop until we get some reform here. The reality is nothing much is going to happen in our Congress on anything through the midterms, right? Nothing is going to happen. And so I think, 2015, once we see how the dust settles, I think what everyone tells me is they have to see, how we have some Tea Party people, some folks on the Democratic side who are actually running on the surveillance stuff, right? And sort of libertarian kind of themes. And we'll see how that plays as a political issue. But I think that the folks who want to see this happen are prepared to take it up and try to push it. We're going to be right there, and we're going to mobilize our users. We're going to do everything that we have to. This has been an issue that, our whole business is based on user trust, right? And most of the people who use Google are not Americans, right? Most of our traffic, most of our revenue, most of the activity on Google comes from outside of the U.S. So when the U.S. government does stuff to users from around the world, that's a big deal for us. So we're going to be very much in the thick of this fight.
So this is the microphone that works. I'm going to turn it on. And so if you have questions, please line up right over here.
And I request all of you to make your questions, please.
Just
Oh,
steal
sorry.
Sure. There's been talk that the internet might balkanize, which is to say, start to partition. And the White Space Initiative in spectral allocation of the airwaves is going to play a role here. And I see potential tensions. The School of Information has published some papers on spectral allocation. And it's apparent that the airwaves are going to be a critical linchpin in how the internet remains surveillable or not surveillable, what regulations come to play. Can you comment a bit on that?
Just about.
Well, how this whole surveillance thing relates to the airwave regulation issue. In other words, there's an issue that relates the FCC's regulation of the airwaves and surveillance of information flow if it, for instance, jumps off of the landlines to circumvent the surveillance machinery.
Well, I think that you're going to see a pretty close link in lots of governments, certainly our government, between spectrum policy and the national security interest, right? I think they're sort of unwilling to create at least without a lot of thought and deliberation or ways, you sort of create things that they can't monitor at some level. And I think that's true for many of the governments around the world right now, which is too bad. But I don't, and that's probably one of the things that's been holding back some of the reform, right, that we should see, and some of the reallocation of spectrum and some of the things that we should see happening, right? We've been pushing white spaces for some time, and we can't really get any of the Western governments to really do much. The place where we have the best luck has been in South Africa, right? Who's actually we're testing stuff and it's like working and they're very happy about it. But I do think there's a link there that's we're gonna have to deal with. Oh, okay. Is that better? Okay.
Hi, thanks for coming. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how Google is bringing the internet to people who don't have it yet, like in the developing world. Like, how's the Loon project going, or the Allegiance for Affordable Internet, stuff like that?
That's a big priority of ours. We've been investing a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of effort in trying to do some interesting things there. The Loon project, is people don't know, they're balloons actually that we launch, and you can actually get. They fly above planes, below satellites, and they will, with antenna on the ground, they can communicate, and basically you can get internet access to rural areas and places that are hard to get, to dig ditches and lay fiber for. So the tests have been good. We had a couple of stray balloons, which probably won't talk about too much, that landed in interesting places. But that's to be understood or to be expected. But I think that's going well. White Spaces is another initiative actually that is promising in the developing world, although not in the Western countries. And we're hoping that we can test it out there and see, to see if that happens. And Google Fiber ultimately is another example of something. While it's limited now to 3 cities, we just announced 34 more cities in the U.S. And I think we're trying to show that you can deliver really, really fast internet effectively to people. And part of our program there is to say, we're not just delivering it to people in fancy homes who can pay a lot of money for it, but we're going to wire up libraries and schools that are in the coverage areas and make sure that they have the fast internet too. So we hope that we can do this ourselves, catalyze others to get into this and do it the same way we are, and that we can take it global. So those are some of the things we're up to.
Let me just say, Google's a big company, so I wouldn't necessarily expect you to know this, but actually we're
Oh, good.
They're going to speak here at the Liberation Technology Seminar in the fall. So
No, it's awesome. Yes.
Hi, I was intrigued by what you said about trade agreements and free flow of information, so I was hoping I could ask you a bit more about why that's possibly a better mechanism than other things we've tried and what the value proposition is for resistant nations.
For which nations?
Resistant nations and things like TTIP.
Sure. Well, every country wants to participate in trade, right? And everywhere I go, I pretty much try to spend time with sort of the developing sort of digital ecosystems that are going on. I mean, there are internet entrepreneurs pretty much everywhere now, and virtually every government is excited by that prospect, right? And they want to see homegrown internet companies where they are. They want to see all the stuff that's happened in Silicon Valley. They want some of it to happen where they are, right? And I think that you can use trade agreements to say, well, look, you can't be protectionist about it. And obviously, for many of these places, if you're going to build an internet business, they're going to have a global market, right? Because and with few exceptions, China, they're thriving internet businesses with a local market. India probably can have the same and so forth. But for most countries, that's not true. So I think that what you say to these governments is, if you want to participate in the global economy, you need to abide by some rules when it comes to digital information. And it's not like these are crazy new theories. It's just that you can't protect your own companies. You have to open up and you can't create a whole bunch of arbitrary rules that apply to the foreign companies and not your own. And I think that it's a pretty powerful way to do this. And I think it's just, if you look at what Hollywood's been able to do with trade agreements on the copyright and the fighting piracy, they've been able to get lots of provisions. In some cases, getting things into trade agreements that go beyond U.S. copyright law, right? And so that's not a good thing, right? Obviously, we've been pushing back against that pretty hard. But it shows that it's possible, right, to really move the needle. And I think we ought to move the needle in a good way to get more things that ensure internet freedom and free flow into these trade agreements. I think it's definitely possible, and but I think we have to just keep. I was talking to Larry and some others before this, and it's clearly on the agenda, right? And so right now, if they have 10 issues that they're negotiating with the Europeans or the Asian countries, because there hasn't been transparency in these negotiations, which is a separate problem, right? They've all been done in secret and so forth. We're all pushing against that too, but we don't know whether internet freedom is number 3 on the list or number 10 on the list, right? And we want it to be higher, so we have to keep agitating for that and keep pushing, and get the administration, I think, gets it better. You think they would have gotten the importance of the digital sector to the American economy, right? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but they're slowly understanding, that it's not only that it's important, but that it's an export industry, right? Because most of the revenues for U.S. internet companies come, as I said in my remarks, from outside the U.S., right? So, I think that's they're starting to get it.
Thanks.
Howdy. Thanks for coming, David. I was just looking at the latest numbers on Google's search engine market share. And I see it says 67% of search engine traffic is through Google. And I took a look at how long Google logs search engine queries. And it says 9 months before it's anonymized. So 67% of what the world is searching for 9 months. That strikes me as even more of a precious data set than who I'm calling, in comparison to what the government is coming under fire for right now. So I'm just curious why, as a user, as an American citizen, or as a citizen of another nation, why we should trust Google any more or less than we should a government.
Well, I think you should trust us because our track record is good. Have we made mistakes in the privacy area? Of course, but in general, I think we've done a very good job of protecting our users' data, and that's why users use it. If we didn't, we wouldn't have the users. It's just that's just clear. There's nothing that forces people to use Google, and people just wouldn't use us if they didn't trust us. And so the thing about data is we can throw it all away, and I guess some people would be happy with that. It might be kind of tragic because there might be a lot of services that we could create that would do really good things for the world if we had the data, right? So I think we want to be wary about just tossing data for the sake of tossing data. Now, we ought to do things to safeguard it. We ought to anonymize. We ought to make sure that it's not, easy for people to get at it and so forth. But, we do think that, and we have built, pretty, important, the search engine works a lot better because of that data, right? That's why it works well. And there are a lot of other things we can do. I mean, you've heard the flu trends example, and lots of other examples where so-called big data can generate things that are kind of useful. But I think it's a balance between doing that the right way. But again, you should trust but verify, right? As Reagan said, you should always be putting us through our paces and challenging us on the stuff that we say, and making sure that we do the stuff, do the things that we say we're going to do.
Thanks, David. My name is Patrick. In a past life, I worked in security, and I spent a lot of time in countries like Syria and others that shut off access to Google or YouTube, often at times when people needed it the most. And I also saw that people would find technology solutions to get around that, to get around the government protocols, to get around the government technology, and to access Google and YouTube when they wanted to. I'm wondering, in Google's mind, or maybe in your mind, is there a third track here, which is a more sort of covert technology track, and is there anything Google wants to do or feels it should do in fostering, facilitating, or funding these kind of technologies that perhaps help subvert some of these more oppressive governments?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and we have done a fair bit of that. And there was something called uProxy, which we just launched a few months ago. Well, we didn't develop it, but we funded it. So yeah, we have been supportive of those kind of technologies, and encourage people to use them in various places to get around these government. But it's definitely something we've invested in.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming to speak with us today. In terms of notice and takedown, it seems like the trade-off is between censorship from the government and people who have real injuries not being able to seek redress. Where do you see the compromise in that? Is self-regulation viable?
Well, in terms of notice and takedown, I mean, notice and takedown is different in different contexts and in different places around the world.
Like you were saying before.
But it's generally, a part of a legal regime, right? I mean, we take things down when we're notified because for legal reasons, right? In search. Now we have some products like YouTube where we have terms of service because there's certain kinds of things that we don't want to see on YouTube. I mean, you don't have porn on YouTube. That's not because the law says we can't have porn on YouTube. It's just that if we have porn on YouTube, like a lot fewer people will use it, and it won't be as useful. Look, I think it's a good balance, right? Because the problem with if you have a rule that says you just can never, you're responsible, you're liable for bad content if it appears at all on your service, you just won't have the services. Right? I mean, how can you sign up to something like that? How can you be a startup and you want to get going and, someone tries to throw you in jail because there's something bad? Now, that happens to go on your service. Now, I actually was at a big company and an Italian court convicted me because of a bad video, right? So I was actually, a convicted felon in Italy until an appeals court, the Supreme Court of Italy, finally exonerated me, right? So, and I had nothing to do with the video, of course. What's that? How long was that? A few years. Yeah. I think the whole process was something like 5 years. Yeah, I was looking at Fred. Yeah, 5 years or so. So yeah, so you can imagine, if that's the rule, you're not going to see many of these services. So I think it's generally a good balance if you can, you take down the bad stuff when you find out about it. I think that's, we want to be able to do that, but we also want to be able to have these services. And because of the scale and the amount of information involved, you just can't have these kinds of services if you have some rule that dings you for every for something just appearing on your service. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's sometimes other resources.
Yeah.
Go after the poster.
Right.
And notice and takedown does often it applies to virus and content.
Yeah.
I'm Ben. Thanks for speaking to us. I want to ask you a little bit about net neutrality in the FCC, particularly how much of a threat you feel like that situation is at the moment to Google and to the internet and censorship. strategies for moving the conversation forward and getting the FCC better enforcement on that, and if there are other foreign analogs that we might not know about that you would. Make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. No, I think the concept of net neutrality is an important one, and we've been sort of fighting this battle for a long time. I think that in the U.S., I mean, people can argue about this, but I think the big internet providers have largely gotten over the notion that we have to charge these people, or we're going to block someone else's content because we're going to favor our own and all this stuff. It turns out internet access is a really good business, and they're making a lot of money. And our rejoinder to them is always like, if we should be charging you for like YouTube, like, because no one would use your service, like if they didn't have search and Facebook and YouTube and all those kind of things. So that it's kind of played to a stalemate in some ways. I think what we're now talking about is, well, we've got these super bandwidth intensive things like YouTube and Netflix, and I think that will be solved through sort of commercial kind of arrangements at the end of the day. And these are big companies, and so they're just we're gonna deal with the interconnections between networks, and there's gonna be some commercial thing. What I'm more worried about are startups, right, and smaller companies that you need to have these rules, because you can't let the network providers, and there aren't going to be that many of them, and we're becoming one ourselves, right? So we should be subject to these same rules. If Google Fiber ever amounts to a whole lot, we're going to be subject to these rules too. But you can't. You're just not going to have more YouTubes and more Facebooks and so forth if you've got to kowtow to the provider. And for internet users, it would really impoverish the world if we don't have those kinds of basic rules. So we clearly support those. Hopefully they'll get through. I think internationally there's sort of more, if anything, in Europe I think there's sort of more support in some ways for net neutrality principles, and we're seeing some other in other places sort of are ahead of us right now. But I think it's pretty important that they get it right. They're going, they're trying to figure it out. We're a little worried that they're going to go a little too far, right? Because they're, in the recent court opinion, there was discussion about, ability to regulate the internet in ways that they hadn't before under, FCC authority. So you don't want to get, we want to make sure there's the right balance there. But we think that net neutrality rules are pretty important. Vivek?
So if you can indulge me, I'll ask you to assume that you are a legal counsel for the government of India or some other government that's not central to the internet infrastructure today. How would you have given this speech today had you been a counsel for one of them? And how would you argue on those positions?
Sorry, if I was counsel for...
Instead of being the chief legal counsel for Google, if you were the Attorney General in India representing negotiations on how to govern the internet, how would you talk? What positions would you have taken? How would you characterize the internet?
If I was the Attorney General of India?
Correct.
In India? Oh. Well, wow, that's an interesting question. Well, I probably would say something like, well, we're a sovereign country. We have our laws. You can't expect to do business in our country and make money in our country, to have an impact on our citizens, right, and provide all these services to our citizens, shape, their everyday lives in all of this myriad of ways, without being subject to our laws. Right, and if our laws mean that this kinds of, we have a long history, as you're talking about India, we have a long history of violence and sectarian violence and so forth. We have laws that are directed toward dealing with that and making sure that groups don't get offended and insulted by other groups, such that these conflagrations happen and so forth. And we're sorry that doesn't square exactly with your First Amendment jurisprudence in the United States, but this is something that makes sense for our society, and we're the world's largest democracy, and we're elected to carry all of this out, and this is the consensus in our country. So Google, if you want to operate here, then you should respect that. We also have legitimate need, when things happen, to to find the perpetrators. And sure, maybe there's some of the things that we think are offenses against our society you don't think are offenses against your society, but we need to prosecute those things. And if you're going to do business in our country, then you need to provide us with the information that we need in order to prosecute these crimes. It's just a simple matter of sovereignty. How'd I do?
It's a very reasonable argument. How would you respond to that as a Google legal counsel?
I knew you were going to ask me that.
Very persuasive.
I knew you were going to ask me that. Well, look, I mean, it's a tough. Look, we say that. Look, we are going to comply with your laws, right? That's why we have a local experience for your users, in which we'll comply with those laws, and we understand that we respect that you have different notions of free expression than we do. But it's also important that your citizens everywhere have a right to travel, right, virtually, and that they have a right to experience things. Yes, there's a default setting, and we respect that, but they should have a right to, just like they can get on a plane and go to another country and experience other things that might not be legal in your country. We think that some of that ought to work on the internet, and that there's some small amount of sacrificing that small amount of sovereignty, I think, is a reasonable thing for the internet to work well and to provide value for everybody around the world. And as for information, we simply can't turn over all the information to you that's not located in your country. In many ways, we're bound by restriction, the U.S. law that prevents us from doing that, and so we'll cooperate with you to the extent we can legally.
David, good to meet you. And I apologize if I'm repeating a question. I came in late. No. But in regards to China, obviously huge impact in the world globally, and they're just going to keep growing. And in regards to their censorship and your inability to use Google the way that you want to, but you're involved with so many other businesses, how are you engaging China with your other businesses to maybe try and get them to open up in terms of search? Is that not a strategy? What's the long-range plan in regards to China?
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of been the strategy. I mean, folks who, that won't go into the history, but we basically made a decision 4 years ago to say, we're not going to have a local experience for China, because a local experience for China means, outright censorship, and there's this whole infrastructure of censorship that you have to abide by, then we just weren't willing to continue to be entangled with that. And that's still the case today. So Google is available in China to Chinese internet users, but the government, and it's through the default site for users in mainland China is our Hong Kong site, and the government censors that, right? Or they find ways to filter it through the Great Firewall, right? Selectively, they don't block it completely. So our approach has been, we have an advertising business there. It turns out there's folks who want to advertise in other markets, because China's an export economy, right? So we have an export-based advertising business there. We have a whole host of other services that don't involve censorship that we offer there, because we want to make sure some elements of Google are available. But other things that are very popular are just blocked. YouTube's just blocked in China, right? Facebook's blocked in China. So in some ways, it's sort of, it's sort of we've had this status quo since we left and hasn't changed very much. One thing to always, I always want to remind people of is that the political suppression of political dissent and political order is only one element of why the Chinese have this whole edifice, right? Another part of it is it's a national champions policy. So what they want to see is the Chinese internet companies succeed and overseas internet companies not succeed. And so the censorship laws are one very, very nice way of doing that. And it's coupled with other things such as licensing requirements. We can't even own our own internet site in China. You can only own 50% of it, right? So you have to do it through joint ventures. So there are all these kind of rules. If you want to have a maps product in China, there's a separate license, and so on. So I think what's going on, you're seeing development of really big internet companies in China. Some of them are starting to export their services and go beyond the China domestic market. So we really think that it's not, the picture seems pretty bleak to us still, because they're getting away with the censorship. And now we're starting to see, the internet companies that have benefited from the national champions policy, compete globally. And in some ways that's unfair, right? Because they have this protection in their own markets. So anyway, I think we still want to be in China in a way that's constructive and that's consistent with our principles. And so we're hoping that there'll be change there.
Still working on it. And then lastly, the driverless cars, which is a fascinating technology. What's the future for that? I know that Daimler-Benz is really into it as well. And what do you see in terms of time frame where they're actually going to be cars?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, everybody's into it now. The major car companies, Tesla's got a bunch of really good people doing this. I think we're going to see driverless cars. I mean, the first stage are sort of Elon Musk at Tesla likes to talk about, autopilot, right? That the first way, we're really talking not necessarily about driverless, but autopilot, where at least it takes a lot of the burden off the driver and safety and so forth. And we're going to see those kinds of things. We're already seeing them in some cars, right? But we're going to see much more of that over the next few years. I think the ambitions at Google are bigger than that. I mean, I think, actually would like to see driverless cars, right? And think it's possible. I mean, they don't run red lights, right? Just like humans do. And, you can imagine the impact on transportation and, city planning and so forth. If you look at around, in Silicon Valley, like what is most of the land use? Like certainly in the commercial land use, what do you use the land for, right? Parking lots, right? Now, if you had cars that could drop, people off and then go back somewhere else, drop other people off, so forth, maybe you could change the way, we use land, change the way freeways operate if you have cars that can, drive like, 2 or 3 feet from each other on the freeway at 70 miles an hour, which these cars can do, right? So none of that is very far off. So we have to figure out the sort of the legal, frameworks we're going to use and how we're going to do this, and that will be gradual and take some time. But I think you're going to be looking at, autonomous vehicles in some contexts, in not a super long time.
Thank you.
Hi, this is actually 2 questions, but I'll ask it one at a time.
Okay.
The first one is, I do everything Google. I do Gmail, Google Voice, GChat, Google Drive.
Thank you.
So my entire life, yes, Google Plus. So you guys have been my Pied Piper. So my entire life is now stored somewhere on Google. But I haven't paid a penny to you guys. So how hard would you guys fight if I were to suddenly become a person of interest and the government demanded my information? Like, what loyalty do you have to me? I don't pay you any money.
Well,
really...
yes and no. I mean, you kind of do. Like we're advertising based, so you let us, show ads when you're using those services, and so you do a search query and ads show up, and you might click on the ad. So you're paying with your attention, right? Some of the ads are based on we get paid if there's a click, and the advertisers get paid if there's a click, or the advertisers pay us rather if there's a click. In other cases, they pay us just because we showed you the ad. So you actually are paying with your attention, and the fact that there are lots of people doing that is what makes Google attractive to advertisers. So we're very much incentivized financially for you to use our services, and we want you to use our services. That we think it's really important that they be widely used because we're based on our fundamental principle is we want to help people with access to information. So I think we're pretty well incentivized to fight for you, and that's why we do.
Mm-hmm. But how far does that fight go, I guess? Like, if they were to subpoena you for my records, do you notify me, or do you tell me?
We always have a principle of notifying it, unless the areas when with these national security things, these gag orders and so forth, which we're fighting against. Mm-hmm. But every other case, our principle is notify you, fight back, and if they're exceeding what we think is a reasonable scope of the subpoena. We do that every day. Mm-hmm. So we will continue to fight. And, some of these governments are fighting us, in Brazil, for instance. Jennifer made the very important point that, Brazil has been, very loudly complaining about the NSA surveillance and their president, having been, wiretapped by the NSA and all of this kind of stuff. But they want data localization because they want they want access to the information. It's very clear that's what they want. And they've been the most aggressive country in the world in pressing multinational internet companies to hand over content to them, including contents of email, right? And under U.S. law, we're not allowed to do that because the information is stored here. As we sit here today, our top 2 people in Brazil are being fined. Their bank accounts have been attached, and they're running up fines because we refuse to turn over this user information to the Brazilian government because we just don't think we can. It violates our principles and our views. So we are willing to we're helping them out on their fines, but still, that's how would you like it if you're subject to this stuff? We have people who are called into the police station around the world all the time, right? In India, in China many times, in Russia, in Brazil. We've had the French police come to one of our legal assistants' house in Paris, right, looking for stuff. So we're willing to a lot of our employees put their necks out there, so to speak, to push back against the governments that don't like this very much.
And then the second question, shorter. How far do you go? When do you say, okay, we've had enough, you're on your own, to me, to say we can't fight the government anymore? Too many penalties, too many fines?
I don't know. I mean, at some level, we have to just comply, right? In a lot of cases, because the law says we have to comply.
At the threat of what?
Well, if we don't.
For more fines? Or
fines or jail or something.
Who will they jail? Sergey?
A responsible person at Google who made the decision. That's generally how individual corporate liability works.
Or Larry Page?
Yeah. Yeah, me, in other words. Exactly. Thanks.
If I can just say something. U.S. law is a major constraint on
yes.
companies. And so if you want more rights, you need to pressure the U.S. government. And we have a lot of things where we can reform for the laws that protect email from warrantless seizure.
Yes.
Obviously, NSA surveillance reform is a really big issue right now. They can only do so much as gatekeepers because at some point the law compels them to turn it over. And cops will go in and seize the server if they don't. So if you want better law, that some of that is their responsibility not to cave in and to try to let us know when it's being abused. But it's also our responsibility to look at the laws we have and say we want better.
Well said.
Okay, just to be clear, I don't have any answer in mind when asking this question. But I've noticed that the way information is organized on the web in some ways is different from real life, but in a lot of ways follows the normal structures of power. If I Google an article on Syria, for instance, I get like the large news corporations articles first. And if I want to find an article in Arabic, I have to know Arabic to type it into the search query or go to an Arabic site and then translate it. It's like very difficult to find articles in other languages. And I think basically what I'm asking is the internet in a lot of ways follows the normal ways that people interact with information outside of the internet. And I guess my question is, should Google change this, or do you think that it is the internet's place to mimic real life as accurately as possible, or outside life?
No, I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't think philosophically we have any view on that. I think what we're trying to do is provide the information in the best way we can and provide people with the most relevant and useful stuff. I mean, the example you used is a good one. It's a challenging problem in search, and I know that we're trying to do that. In other words, that cross language, right? Results, right? We should be able to do that. Our machine translation is actually really good, and we're doing that a little bit around the edges. But you're right. Like if you type in something, if the most authoritative article on the topic that you're after is written in Arabic, just because you typed your query in English doesn't mean you should still get it, right? So yeah, I think we have our obligation. It should be to do what's sort of best for the user, and presumably since we have technology at our disposal and we're supposed to be innovating, we'll do something better than real life, the offline world, right? That's what we aspire to. But it's still early days in a lot of ways.
Hi. In the context of the NSA leaks, last fall, I heard about a revelation that seemed to suggest that the NSA, in kind of interpreting their jurisdiction of foreign data, interpreted it as basically any data that crosses foreign infrastructure becomes foreign data, like with Google needing to encrypt data going between international data centers was an example of that sort of context. And so I'm wondering, are there either pre-existing norms for like kind of ownership of data by nationalities in the legal sphere to kind of like invalidate a definition like that? Or if not, is that a significant part of the current conversation in either nationally or internationally?
Well, it's certainly, I guess the answer to the first part of the question is kind of no. It's kind of, I think the NSA takes a position that they're after information on foreign persons. And so wherever the data is, they believe if it's about somebody, outside the U.S., then they can get it, even if that data is inside the U.S. And that the fact that they incidentally get a lot of information about Americans is, they try to minimize it and all these other things. But I think it's part of the conversation because that's what a lot of the folks around the world are saying. Well, wait a minute, we should be giving rights to people outside. It seems like Americans have these rights, but people outside the U.S. don't have any rights when it comes to the U.S. government. So why shouldn't we have rights? And people are talking. That's what's driving a lot of this data localization stuff. But I think people are. We get asked whether we can segment our users in ways that where we can sort of identify certain kinds of data as only being from a certain place. I don't think it works very well, and I don't think we figured out a way to technically do anything like that. I don't think it would be a good thing to do it. But right now, unless we reform, as Jennifer said, we need to reform these laws to make it more clear. And one of the things I actually think we should do is make sure, and to be fair, the minister, the president did say that he was going to do something in this regard, but to give some more rights and protections for non-Americans, because it's kind of crazy, and it doesn't work. I was actually in Europe when the initial Snowden revelations came out, and just sitting there in front of people trying to explain how Google had nothing to do with this, and we weren't sort of in cahoots with the U.S. government. I always tell this story about I'm in Amsterdam, and I'm at this dinner with a lot of these internet people and politicians and so forth, and they're all like, we're all talking about this NSA thing, and they're like, I've never been in a situation where someone said, I've had people say that I was spinning them or I was being disingenuous or something, but someone to say, you're just lying, right? When I said, no, we don't have any, we're not working with, we have no partnership, we just respond to legal requests. And then they say, well, you're just lying, and by the way, it's okay, because I know you can't tell me the truth, right? So you're like, well, what am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to say to that, right? It's very hard to have a comeback on that. But I digress, but I did want to, just pointing out that, the feeling, the sort of visceral feeling people had to hear, our officials say, who cares? It's just a bunch of foreigners, was pretty bad, and that's what's gotten us in a lot of the problems that we're dealing with. But I think we have to provide some protections for people of all countries when we reform this thing.
We're almost out of time. If you both be brief, we can take you both close.
Good evening, Mr. Drummond. Interestingly, my question is actually about that, and I'm not certain yet that you may have addressed mine, so I'll just go ahead and ask. On the one hand, we all seem to expect that our governments will, to some extent, be protective of our liberties, and at the same time, find ways to glean necessary information to ensure that things like terrorist attacks, etc., are averted. On the other, it's interesting because we all seem to, at the very least, take umbrage, at the fact that our governments have certain pieces of information or data about us and may actually know who we are individually. And so many times I do contemplate what life would look like had Edward Snowden's issue or disclosure not come out there. And it constantly strikes me continually that Google, Yahoo, Facebook all came out, and quite to their credit, to disclose, nevertheless, though, that they were not complicit to anything, but no one really sent a clear, precise, unambiguous message out to the public. I grew up in a place where you had CCTVs everywhere, and you kind of know that that's what the government's doing, and we like it. Well, most people, I think, do like it. But, it's kind of clear, it's said, it's stated, and I found, still defined, that, only months afterwards, the different companies actually come out and say, okay, here are the number of requests we had. In the years blah, blah, blah to blah, 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 we had these requests, some of which were this or that. And so my question simply is, to what extent do you think you have a responsibility to actually disclose before some whistleblower does, or before you find yourself in a corner, that you let denizens know the extent to which you're cooperating with governments?
I think we do have a responsibility, which is why, my view was that we should be able to tell the world about every single government request that we get around the world from any government of any, local, national, whatever. And that's what we aspire to do. We're the first ones who came out with the transparency report. That was years before the Snowden revelations. So we've been doing this, and we've been negotiating, now fighting with the national security people to be able to give you numbers on these secret ones that we get, right? And we've been somewhat successful in that so far. So yeah, we have the responsibility. I think we've been carrying out the responsibility as much as we can. We were disclosing government requests before the Snowden stuff happened, years before it happened. And even before it happened, we convinced the FBI to let us disclose things about these so-called national security letters and so forth. So look, I don't think any of the secrecy makes any sense, right? I think we should have transparency for all of this stuff, because I just don't buy the arguments that somehow the terrorists are going to learn what to do if companies simply say, give you categories of types of requests they received, if we don't talk about what was actually asked for. So I think we need a lot more transparency, but I think the companies are, more and more companies. Every day it seems like I read about a new company that's issuing a transparency report, and that's a good thing. I think it's not enough. We have not achieved my goal yet of being able to disclose and explain in detail, if we need to, every request we get from governments, but we're still working on it.
Awesome, thanks.
Thank you. So, I'm a mathematician, so I look at some of these things from the technical side, and I find that some of the techniques that people use to study networks, say to look for patterns, to target advertisements, and things like that, are probably very similar to the kind of technology that's used to target and look for terrorists and other sorts of threats that people might be doing in the government. And it seems like that's a natural opportunity for people who have this technical ability in the corporate world or in the commercial sector to sort of contract or help the government in these sorts of activities. I wonder if Google does this sorts of work, and if it doesn't, if it has any plans to do so, or if it has any principles about the kinds of services that they would be willing to provide to the government for whatever purposes they want.
No, there are lots of companies that contract with the government and provide their computer science skills and computational skills and data skills, and that's their business, right? It's not our business. We have no interest in it. We don't do it. So the answer is no.
Well, on that succinct uplifting note, David, thank you so much for these really great.